The judge fined her $15,000 just for telling the truth. She should have broken down. But instead, the whole room stood up. Jasmine Crockett brought the system to light, and she did it in seconds. Post in the comments where are you watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the latest stories. The grand courtroom, with its soaring ceilings and imposing marble columns, was a stage set for confrontation. On this brisk autumn morning in Washington, D.C., the air was thick with anticipation and unspoken tension. The polished wooden benches and stern portraits of past jurists bore silent witness to a drama that would soon shake the foundations of public trust. Today, the hearing was more than a legal proceeding. It was a battleground where truth and power collided, and at the heart of this storm was Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine, known for her fierce integrity and uncompromising commitment to justice, had long been the voice for the marginalized and the oppressed. Her reputation in legal circles was as formidable as it was inspiring. Her sharp tongue and unwavering dedication to uncovering the truth had earned her both admiration and enmity. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet power, she walked into the courtroom with calm resolve, her eyes focused and her posture erect. Despite the heaviness of the situation, her demeanor radiated a tangible aura of dignity and purpose. At the front of the courtroom sat Federal Judge Alexander Whitmore, a man whose reputation for judicial prudence was now marred by whispers of bias and partisanship. Known among some circles as a stern enforcer of his own version of justice, Judge Whitmore wasted no time in setting a tone that was both demeaning and domineering. As the hearing began, his voice boomed through the high-ceilinged room, laced with a palpable disdain that seemed personally targeted at Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett," he intoned, his tone clipped and dismissive. "This court requires that all parties show the utmost respect for its proceedings. I trust you understand that any deviation from decorum will not be tolerated." His words, delivered with calculating precision, sent a shiver through the gallery. It was as if his sentence was not merely a reminder of court protocol but a thinly veiled admonishment directed solely at her. The judge's glare was intense enough to chill even the most stalwart members of the public, and yet Jasmine's eyes, calm and resolute, met his with an unspoken defiance. The audience, a mix of legal professionals, activists, and ordinary citizens, watched in rapt attention. Their murmurs of anticipation were punctuated by the occasional gasp as Judge Whitmore's words grew harsh, his voice rising with each interruption. Jasmine had been summoned as a witness in a case concerning alleged corruption within governmental ranks, a case that, while ostensibly about high-level malpractice, had larger implications for accountability and the integrity of public institutions. As the judge began questioning her, it became evident that his intent was not to seek the truth but to undermine her credibility. At first, Jasmine maintained a graceful composure. When asked pointedly about her involvement in exposing questionable political donations, she replied succinctly, her voice even and unwavering, "I stand for transparency and accountability, principles that form the bedrock of justice in our nation." Yet, with every answer, Judge Whitmore interjected with venomous sarcasm and curt dismissals. "Your statements border on the inflammatory," he snapped, leaning forward so that his thin lips curled into a sneer. "It appears you believe that your personal crusade grants you license to undermine the decorum of this court." Each word from the bench struck like a gavel against a trembling heart, yet Jasmine's resolve only deepened. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the raw energy of an impending clash. Observers noted how the judge's rhetoric seemed designed to humiliate and silence, a stark attempt to undercut her every word by asserting an unchallengeable authority. The contrast between Jasmine's measured integrity and the judge's unbridled contempt could not have been starker. As the tension grew, the first seeds of injustice took root. It was not simply the verbal assaults that unsettled those present, but an insidious message embedded in every curt interruption and every dismissive laugh shared by the judge with his colleagues. His bias was wearing thin the veneer of impartiality that the judicial system was meant to embody. In his eyes, accusing looks flashed toward Jasmine as if to say, "You dare speak against the mighty? You will learn your place." Yet, every word she spoke radiated defiance and unyielding commitment to truth, a truth that, as many in the gallery believed, deserved to be heard. Even as Judge Whitmore's condescension built toward an inevitable climax, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her spirit unbroken. The courtroom, with every spectator holding its breath, sensed that this confrontation was about more than a single hearing. It was about challenging a system that silenced dissent and cloaked injustice in the guise of authority. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of an increasingly restless public, the seeds of revolution were being sown, one measured word at a time. The tension in the courtroom swelled to a palpable pressure with every passing moment. As soon as Judge Whitmore's opening diatribe had faded into the heavy air of the chamber, Jasmine Crockett rose to continue her testimony. The moment was charged with defiance and a silent promise to speak truth even in the face of derision. Her voice, when it came, was measured and powerful, each word deliberate, every phrase underscoring her steadfast commitment to justice. "Your Honor," she began, her tone calm yet firm. "The duty of this court is to seek the truth and to ensure that justice is administered fairly, regardless of personal biases." But before she could proceed further, Judge Whitmore abruptly cut her off with a dismissive snort. "Ms. Crockett, I must remind you that decorum is paramount. Your audacity to parade your opinions in this hallowed hall, as if it were your personal platform, is most unbecoming," he barked, his voice echoing with a mix of condescension and veiled hostility. The judge's interjection ignited a spark of indignation in the room. Although the gallery murmured in response, many of the onlookers were left holding their breaths. They knew Jasmine, renowned for her razor-sharp rhetoric and unwavering courage, was not one to be easily cowed. Standing tall before the bench, she glanced directly at the judge, her eyes burning with intensity and a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any shouted rebuttal. "I must insist," Jasmine said, her voice steady and resonant, "that we remain focused on the issues at hand, the clear evidence of judicial prejudice and misuse of authority that have been brought before this court." With each word, her tone carried the weight of her convictions. She detailed her findings of internal memos, public records, and affidavits that pointed squarely at a pattern of bias, noting the judge's close affiliations with political figures known for seeking to suppress dissent. At this, Judge Whitmore's face flushed a deep red. With a tone heavy with scorn, he retorted, "This is not a platform for personal grievances or for airing extrajudicial critiques. Your so-called evidence is nothing more than a collection of contested opinions, not admissible facts." He leaned forward, the stern lines of his face tightening as he continued, "I hereby find your repeated attempts to subvert the court's authority an act of disrespect." The room fell silent as his words registered. Tension thickened. Every spectator sensed that an irreparable fissure was forming within the walls of justice. Despite the judge's vehement admonishments, Jasmine held her ground. Her eyes, unblinking and resolute, conveyed an unyielding spirit that refused to be intimidated. "Your Honor," she replied calmly, "if what you call opinion is not recognized as evidence in this court, then I ask you to explain how decisions are reached on matters not supported by objective truth. I am merely advocating for transparency and accountability, values that ought to guide every legal proceeding." Her words rippled across the room like a clarion call, reverberating among the assembled jurists, lawmakers, and onlookers who sensed that something was terribly amiss behind the judge's imperious facade. Judge Whitmore was incensed. His tone became sharper, charged with a hunger to quash her dissent. "I warn you, Ms. Crockett," he spat. "Your continued disruption will force me to take measures against you. This court demands respect, and your behavior jeopardizes the decorum we have maintained for centuries." A murmur of discontent passed through the gallery, a mixture of shocked disbelief and quiet support for Jasmine captured in furtive glances and raised eyebrows. For a brief, charged moment, neither party yielded. The audacity of Jasmine's challenge, her insistence on holding the court accountable for its own biases, had shaken the imposing veneer of Judge Whitmore. In that moment, it became clear to all in attendance that this was not merely about a fine or a reprimand. It was a battle for the soul of the justice system. Jasmine's unwavering dignity in the face of blatant disrespect was stirring emotions in everyone present. from seasoned advocates to ordinary citizens who had come seeking resolution and truth. Though the judge's words tried to diminish her protest, every syllable Jasmine uttered resonated like a beacon of hope. Even as he threatened further sanctions, intimations of fines that loomed ominously over her head, she met each barb with facts and calm rhetoric. The courtroom had transformed into an arena where the traditional hierarchy of power was being questioned, and the eyes of the nation were fixed on Jasmine Crockett, whose defiant stance was setting a precedent that the truth, when spoken with integrity, could challenge even the most entrenched authorities. The tension in the courtroom, already electric from the earlier confrontation, reached a fever pitch the moment Judge Whitmore's gavel came down with decisive finality. In a voice that brooked no dissent, the judge declared, "In light of your repeated interruptions and your flagrant disregard for this court's authority, I hereby impose a fine of $15,000 against you, Ms. Crockett, for disrespect to the court." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The sum was not merely punitive. It was intended to be crippling, a financial gauntlet thrown at the feet of a woman who had dared to stand for truth. The shock was visible on the faces of the legal professionals, the activists, and the ordinary citizens watching from the public gallery. Even the seasoned journalists who had long learned to expect spectacle were taken aback at the overt display of judicial power wielded with apparent personal bias. Jasmine Crockett's expression remained composed, yet her eyes narrowed with an intensity born of righteous indignation. The fine, meant to silence her, did nothing to quell her determination. Instead, it further galvanized her resolve. With a steady voice and unwavering tone, she responded, "Your Honor, if this fine is intended to quiet me, then know that I stand before you not to be silenced, but to be heard. In any system that prides itself on justice, accountability must not bow to intimidation." Her words, measured and deliberate, cut through the oppressive atmosphere in the courtroom like a clarion call. Judge Whitmore's eyes flashed with anger, and his tone dripped with condescension as he replied, "The court is not in the habit of tolerating such insolence. Let this fine serve as a reminder to all that decorum is non-negotiable in this venerable institution." With that, he banged his gavel, as if he could stamp out dissent with the very sound of authority. But what Judge Whitmore failed to understand was that Jasmine Crockett's spirit was not so easily subdued. As the session proceeded, a murmur of disquiet began to rise among the spectators, many of whom had already recognized the biased tenor of the proceedings. Behind the judge's ostentatious displays of power, whispers spread like wildfire about his questionable political affiliations and a pervasive pattern of favoritism that had been noted in prior cases. Jasmine's courtroom performance had become much more than a personal struggle. It was quickly morphing into a symbol of systemic injustice. After the session adjourned, Jasmine retreated to a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway. Her face, though devoid of outward anger, betrayed the steely determination within. In her mind, she already began to marshal her next steps. Cautiously, she retrieved a slim folder from her briefcase. The folder contained meticulously archived evidence, compilations of internal memos, public records, and documents that demonstrated Judge Whitmore's close ties to powerful political donors and lobbyists known for their attempts to stifle dissenting voices in the judiciary. Later that evening, under the flickering lights of a private conference room in a nearby legal center, Jasmine convened an impromptu meeting with a select group of trusted colleagues and whistleblowers. There, she outlined her plan of action. "They want to silence me by levying a fine, but I refuse to be muzzled by someone who believes his personal vendetta gives him divine authority," she declared, her passion underscored by every measured gesture. "We have the evidence to prove that this fine is nothing more than a politically motivated attempt to squash a voice of reason. It is time we expose this blatant abuse of power." Her colleagues, many of whom had long suspected that the scales of justice were being tipped in favor of the influential few, nodded in resolute agreement. Together, they began to assemble a dossier that not only detailed the fine but also connected the dots between Judge Whitmore's rulings and his under-the-table dealings with those who sought to shape public policy behind closed doors. Even as the pressure of the fine loomed large on her personal finances, Jasmine's focus shifted to the larger battle, a fight for the right of every citizen to see the truth reflected in their courts. In the days that followed, As the court's decision made headlines in local media outlets, a maverick group of tech-savvy activists and journalists moved quickly to acquire video evidence. Unbeknownst to Judge Whitmore and his loyal aides, a member of the gallery had discreetly recorded the heated exchange. This raw footage, capturing the judge's derisive intonations and the cruel insistence on the fine, was now circulating among independent media circles. The video clip, when released online, exploded into virality. Social media was alive with hashtags questioning judicial impartiality. They spread like digital wildfire. The short clip, though only a few minutes long, encapsulated everything the American public had come to despise in a system that often prioritized power over truth. The video showed Judge Whitmore's inflated rhetoric, his dismissive sneers, and the shocking imposition of a $15,000 fine on a woman who had dared to challenge him. The public reaction was immediate and widespread. Legal pundits, community organizers, and everyday citizens decried the blatant display of partiality. In a series of impassioned interviews broadcast on national television, Jasmine condemned the fine as not just a personal attack, but an assault on the very ideals of justice and accountability. If my silence in the face of intimidation is to be punished, then let it also be a mirror for our nation, she declared, her voice resonating with the weight of truth. When those in power use monetary sanctions to muzzle critique and silence the voices of dissent, they poison the well of our democracy. I will not be that mute statistic, and I will not stand idly by while injustice is dressed in the facade of legal procedure. With her eloquent defiance, Jasmine transformed what was intended as a punitive measure into a catalyst for exposing the corruption simmering beneath the veneer of the judicial system. Her meticulous gathering of evidence, combined with the viral spread of the damning video, turned the tide of public opinion. What began as a personal trial was rapidly evolving into a nationwide outcry for accountability and reform, a movement that promised to hold even the highest authorities to the rigid standards of fairness and transparency. In the echo of that fateful day, it became clear that the fine was not the end of Jasmine Crockett's fight. It was merely the spark that ignited a battle for justice that would resonate far beyond the confines of that courtroom. Every dollar of the imposed penalty became a symbol of resistance, a testament to the courage required to confront a system that sought to silence those who dared to expose its flaws. As the courtroom slowly emptied after the shock of the fine, an electric silence gave way to a low, collective murmur that rippled through the gallery. In that charged moment, when the formal proceedings had ended but the echoes of injustice still reverberated off ornate walls, a handful of brave individuals began to mobilize. Smartphones emerged from bags and pockets with flickering screens as if in unison, their lenses trained not on the polished exhibits of justice, but on the unraveling of a system that had sought to silence one woman's voice. Among the audience was Maria, a middle-aged community organizer known to many for her quiet dignity and fierce commitment to civil rights. With trembling fingers, she activated the video recording app on her phone. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of heartbreak and defiance, captured every detail of the judge's derisive posturing as he attempted to justify the hefty $15,000 fine. In whispered tones, fellow spectators, veterans whose weathered faces testified to decades of hardship, retired teachers, and families with scars of forgotten injustices, exchanged incredulous glances. They recognized that what they were witnessing was far more than adjudication. It was a public spectacle of authority misused to quash dissent. Across the room, a young legal intern from a respected civil rights organization, whose discreet nod confirmed her resolve, began sharing her phone's live stream with a local news outlet. More and more, smartphone screens lit up with the raw footage. Judge Whitmore's sneering rebuttals, the dismissive gestures directed at Jasmine Crockett, and the resolute calm with which Jasmine met every overbearing interruption. Every detail was recorded. The judge's condescending tone, his flushed expression, and the palpable tension in the air as he barked out orders. A close-up view captured the fine on the projection screen, a numerical figure that loomed like an anchor intended to weigh down her credibility. Yet, the very act of imposing that penalty only seemed to strengthen the resolve in Jasmine's eyes, a silent testament to her unwavering commitment to truth. The recording quickly gathered momentum among those present. An elderly man, who had spent his life fighting for fairness in his own small way, shook his head as he watched the video and murmured to a neighbor, "This is the abuse of power we've come to tolerate." His words were faint, yet they carried the emotional weight of decades of witnessing systemic injustice. In hushed conversations, many recalled previous cases where quiet voices had been trampled underfoot by the very institutions meant to protect them. Now they had indisputable evidence on their side, visual proof that the scales of justice were being manipulated by one man's arrogance. Within minutes, messages and social media posts began to circulate. Tweets filled with hashtags such as #CrockettSpeaks, #JusticeForAll, and #SilenceBroken spread rapidly. The video, raw and unedited, provided a window into a moment that no one could unsee. Law professors, activists, and everyday citizens alike commented on the extraordinary gravity of what was unfolding before them, sharing their disbelief at how a fine, meant as a tool of suppression, had inadvertently sparked an outpouring of public scrutiny. Newsrooms picked up on the footage almost as soon as it was uploaded. In studio panels and on primetime broadcasts, anchors revisited the moment when Jasmine Crockett had stood firm in the face of judicial intimidation, turning a punitive measure into a rallying cry for reform. Journalists questioned not only the appropriateness of the fine but also the apparent bias that Judge Whitmore had long exhibited. A bias that now, unmasked on the record, threatened to undermine the court's very legitimacy. Outside the courthouse, a palpable energy of revolt began to build. Small groups of protesters gathered, their signs echoing demands for accountability and transparency. "Speak truth to power," and "No more silent justice" became rallying cries among those who had shared the video online. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the courthouse steps became a makeshift stage for impassioned speeches by local activists and community members. They decried the misuse of monetary punishment as a tool of control and argued that Jasmine Crockett had done nothing less than expose a fundamental flaw in the system. For Jasmine, the actions of a few determined souls in the gallery had transformed her personal battle into an awakening for many. Though she remained in the midst of legal proceedings, her stance in that moment, unyielding, dignified, and truth-bound, had ignited a spark among the silent many. Against the backdrop of a powerful injustice broadcast in real time, the public had taken up the mantle of accountability. The video, now being disseminated across digital platforms, served as undeniable evidence that something was deeply wrong within the judicial halls of power. In every whispered conversation, every shared smartphone screen, and every viral post, the gallery's collective voice rose. A voice too strong to be silenced or dismissed. It was a chorus that would not fade, a living testament to the idea that when one woman refuses to be silenced, her courage inspires a multitude to demand justice. And as the digital evidence rippled outward, it signaled the beginning of an uprising built not on anger, but on the relentless pursuit of truth. Within hours of the gallery's recording surfacing online, the video of Judge Whitmore's condescending tirade and the resolute composure of Jasmine Crockett became a lightning rod for public outrage. Social media platforms buzzed with activity as the video was shared, reposted, and remixed by thousands, then millions of Americans. Newsrooms across the country scrambled to cover the unfolding controversy. Prominent television anchors and respected print journalists alike devoted entire segments to dissecting the events of that fateful day. In lengthy op-eds and impassioned editorials, pundits questioned how a court entrusted with upholding justice could sanction a fine so exorbitant and so clearly politically motivated. The video, raw and unedited, captured every sneer, every dismissive gesture from Judge Whitmore, transforming what was meant to suppress dissent into a public demonstration against systemic bias. Pressure mounted not only from the digital realm but also from the streets. Across major cities, from the bustling avenues of New York to the quiet towns of the Midwest, protests were organized. Peaceful demonstrators gathered outside courthouses and public squares, holding signs that decried judicial tyranny and demanded transparency. Their chants, measured yet resolute, echoed the sentiment that no individual, even a judge, should wield power above accountability. Banners proclaimed mottos like, "Speak truth to power," and "When one is silenced, many must speak," reinforcing the message that Jasmine Crockett's stand was emblematic of a broader fight for justice. Amidst this whirlwind, Jasmine Crockett emerged as the reluctant yet powerful symbol of this grassroots movement. A few days after the video's explosion online, she agreed to a wildly anticipated live interview on a nationally televised news program. The interview was set in a modest public studio, its backdrop displaying images of iconic courthouse steps and American flags, symbols of the very justice system she was determined to hold accountable. Seated across from the interviewer, her gaze was calm and direct. The image of Jasmine Crockett, dignified and unbowed, had become a beacon for those who felt marginalized by an opaque system. With measured, deliberate words, she spoke not with anger, but with a steely resolve that resonated with viewers across the airwaves. Today, I stand not as a lone voice against injustice, but as one among millions who believe in the power of truth, Jasmine said, her tone imbued with both empathy and quiet fortitude. When a judge uses his position to silence dissent and shield his own biases, it is not just an attack on my right to speak. It's an assault on the very ideals that make our justice system fair and open. I am here to demand accountability, not retribution. Transparency, not intimidation. Her words were met with a hushed admiration in the studio and an eruption of supportive messages on social media. The interview quickly became one of the most watched programs of the year. Clusters of retired judges, legal scholars, and civil society leaders took to the media with their own testimonials, echoing her call for reform in the system. Commentators marveled at her ability to transform what was intended as a punitive measure into a rallying cry for change. The impact was immediate. Within days, polls indicated that a growing majority of Americans believed that the judiciary needed an overhaul to root out the influence of politics and personal vendettas. Grassroots organizations coordinated letter-writing campaigns and social media rallies urging legislative bodies and judicial oversight committees to hold Judge Whitmore and any other biased officials accountable. Legislators in several states even introduced bills aimed at ensuring greater transparency and fairer disciplinary measures within the courts. The digital storm did not cease at mere outrage, however. A particularly searing clip, capturing Judge Whitmore's most contemptuous remarks, was shared repeatedly, each iteration annotated by impassioned citizens outlining how every dollar of that $15,000 fine represented an affront to justice. The viral spread transcended the internet. Local radio shows morphed into impromptu forums for discussion on judicial accountability, and major newspapers in traditionally conservative regions published front-page editorials decrying the misuse of power. In a powerful moment that epitomized the public's response, a renowned civil rights attorney, speaking at a town hall meeting in a small Midwestern community, remarked, "When one woman speaks out, millions begin to speak." Jasmine Crockett has reminded us that the law is not an impenetrable shield for the mighty, but a promise that every voice matters. Such words found fertile ground among a populace long weary of systemic inequities and now galvanized by a singular act of eloquent defiance. As the momentum built, pressure began to mount on the federal and state authorities to initiate an investigation into Judge Whitmore's conduct. Committees were formed, public hearings scheduled, and legal watchdog groups assembled, determined to document every instance of judicial misconduct. This surge of accountability was a testament to the collective awakening fueled by the viral video, a transformation of a personal legal battle into a nationwide movement demanding a more transparent and just system. For Jasmine, who had deliberately chosen the path of truth over silence, each message of support and each public display of solidarity was both a balm to her earlier ordeals and a call to further action. She continued to speak out at rallies, at legal panels, and through op-eds in major publications. Her every word tended to reinforce the narrative that justice, though imperfect, was worth fighting for, and that the courage to confront systemic abuse could, indeed, transform an institution as venerable as the judiciary. In the steadily intensifying echo of her collective cry, an undeniable truth had emerged. When a woman refuses to be silenced, her words, and the truth they carry, resonate across the nation, awakening a dormant populace to a shared purpose. And as the movement swelled, the eyes of a deeply divided country turned toward the impending reckoning of power, a reckoning that promised to shape the course of justice for generations to come. In the wake of the viral outcry, The pressure on the judicial establishment crescendoed to a deafening roar. Under relentless scrutiny from the media, advocacy groups, and a nation demanding accountability, an emergency ethics hearing was scheduled for federal Judge Alexander Whitmore. The day of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if the very sky wept for the integrity of justice itself. Inside a somber hearing room at the Federal Judicial Ethics Commission, a collection of eminent attorneys, retired judges, and respected legal scholars gathered to review the disturbing evidence. The room was hushed with anticipation and solemnity, a far cry from the theatrics of the courtroom where Judge Whitmore had once wielded his authority with ruthless disdain. Now, faces etched with experience and moral gravity turned toward the man in question, their eyes demanding transparency and fair judgment. Judge Whitmore entered the chamber, his usual confident stride now replaced with a measured pace that betrayed a hint of unease. Dressed in the vestments of his office, yet much diminished in stature before this council of his peers, he took his seat at a long, polished table. Flanked by stern-faced commissioners and an array of legal experts, he appeared smaller than ever, a man whose reputation now hung precariously on the fulcrum of public opinion and ethical accountability. The session began with a presentation of the evidence gathered by Jasmine Crockett and the digital activists. A series of video excerpts, documenting the judge's derogatory language and high-handed imposition of the $15,000 fine, were projected for all to see. The footage captured every micro-expression. The sneer that curled at the corner of his mouth, the dismissive wave of his hand, the tone of his voice that dripped with insolence. With each play, the commission members exchanged solemn looks, their faces reflecting the weight of decades of trust in the judiciary now threatened by one man's unchecked arrogance. One senior commissioner, her voice measured and resolute, asked, "Judge Whitmore, do you acknowledge that the evidence before us suggests a pattern of conduct that falls short of the impartiality expected of a federal judge?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge, a call for the truth to be laid bare without embellishment or excuse. For a long, tense moment, silence reigned. Judge Whitmore's eyes darted around the room, as if seeking an escape or a shred of exoneration in the sea of expectant faces. Then, with a measured sigh that spoke of internal struggle, he began to respond in halting phrases that seemed rehearsed more than sincere. He attempted to frame his decisions as necessary measures to maintain courtroom order, yet his words did little to counter the damning documentary evidence meticulously assembled by Jasmine and her allies. Outside the chamber, the atmosphere was equally charged. News cameras captured the moment as legal experts and activists gathered in small clusters near the courthouse entrance, their voices low but determined. Online, social media feeds exploded with hashtags such as #JudicialReckoning, #AccountabilityNow, and, most poignantly, #CrockettTruth. Every citizen seemed to have a stake now in the question of whether privilege and bias had infiltrated the halls of justice. During the proceedings, an unexpected twist emerged. A meticulously preserved email exchange was presented by one of the commission members, an email in which Judge Whitmore's close political associate had alluded to quietly eliminating dissent by financially penalizing outspoken critics. This revelation, corroborated by other documents obtained from whistleblowers within the courthouse, suddenly shifted the ethical inquiry from a matter solely of misplaced judicial decorum to one of overt political collusion and abuse of power. The commissioners exchanged grave looks as they absorbed the significance of this discovery. One noted, "This is not merely an isolated incident of poor judgment. It is evidence of systemic malfeasance." The gravity of the situation was underscored by the fact that, in that single email, the seeds of a calculated strategy to suppress dissent were laid bare for all to see. Judge Whitmore attempted to offer excuses and justifications, but his responses grew increasingly defensive, faltering under the dual assault of incontrovertible evidence and the piercing questions of the commission. His previously unassailable facade of authority crumbled bit by bit, replaced by a growing realization that his actions had not only discredited himself, but also eroded public trust in the very institution he was meant to uphold. As the hearing neared its conclusion, the mood in the chamber had shifted dramatically. More commissioners voiced their dismay and called for disciplinary measures that ranged from formal reprimands to full removal from the bench. The session's final report, still in draft, hinted at substantial ethical violations, recommending that the matter be forwarded to higher judicial oversight bodies for further investigation and possible sanctions. The reverberations of the hearing were immediate and far-reaching. Legal journals and mainstream media outlets began to speculate on the future career of Judge Whitmore, and protests outside the courthouse intensified, demanding that justice not only be done but that it be seen to be done. Citizens felt vindicated in their belief that unchecked power, when exposed by courageous voices like Jasmine Crockett's, could indeed be dismantled. In the midst of this maelstrom, Jasmine remained steadfast and dignified, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding within the corridors of power. Though she had paid a personal price for her defiance, the ethical reckoning of Judge Whitmore catalyzed nationwide discussions about accountability, fairness, and the sanctity of judicial integrity. Her unwavering truth had set into motion a chain of events that would force the establishment to confront its own failings. The day dawned with a sense of renewal that seemed to have seeped into every corner of the nation's conscience. In a packed public hearing held in a grand civic auditorium in Washington, D.C., its walls adorned with images of American justice and resilience, Jasmine Crockett finally received the vindication she had fought so relentlessly for. After an exhaustive and impassioned review by the Federal Judicial Oversight Committee, Judge Alexander Whitmore was held accountable for his actions, and the ruthless fine that had been imposed on Jasmine was officially rescinded. The committee's report, a document of unflinching truth, detailed the judge's pattern of coercion, his politically motivated penalties, and the inherent bias that had tarnished his decisions. In response to the overwhelming evidence and the roar of a public that would not tolerate injustice, the judge was ethically censured and placed on immediate suspension from duty pending further investigation by the higher judicial authorities. For Jasmine, that moment marked not only a personal exoneration but the beginning of a nationwide reawakening. Earlier that morning, as news bulletins and social media feeds were lit up with the committee's findings, citizens across the country began to see her struggle as emblematic of a broader battle for transparency, fairness, and accountability in all branches of government. Soon, the images of her poised stance in the courtroom, the viral clip of her measured defiance, and the damning evidence against Judge Whitmore were interwoven into the tapestry of public discourse. Headlines screamed of reform and resistance, and the hashtag Crockett for Justice ignited rallying cries on every major platform. Later that afternoon, with the auditorium thrumming with anticipation, Jasmine stepped up to the podium to address the assembled crowd. A diverse congregation spanning from elderly former activists to young law students and everyday citizens yearning for change. Standing beneath a banner emblazoned with "Truth Unbound, Justice for All," she exuded the calm fortitude and spirited eloquence that had become her trademark. The murmurs dimmed to hushed silence as she raised her hand, and it was as if the very air stilled in expectation. Today, Jasmine began, her voice clear and resonant. We reclaim not only our dignity and our rights, but the promise that truth must always prevail over tyranny. For too long, the voices of those who demanded honesty and integrity were drowned out by the clamor of power politics and oppressive authority. She paused, allowing her words to fully sink in, before continuing with a measured cadence that bore the weight of every injustice she had witnessed. I did not come here to wage a battle through anger or defiance born of resentment. I came to shine a light, one that would reveal the cracks in a system that pretends to be impartial, yet hides behind the guise of tradition and decorum. We have exposed those who, under the cloak of judicial authority, sought to silence voices that dared to seek accountability. Her eyes swept across the room, meeting the expectant gazes of activists, legal scholars, and everyday heroes alike. Our liberation from silence, she declared, is not obtained by intimidation, but by the courage to speak honestly and by the unity we forge in its echo. I stand before you not as a lone dissenter but as one representative of millions who have been hurt by injustice, a woman who has turned oppression into an opportunity for truth. And today, the scales of justice are being rebalanced. As her words reverberated throughout the hall, spontaneous applause broke out, swelling into a sustained ovation that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Outside, thousands had already gathered on the steps of government buildings and public squares, their signs and voices proclaiming hope and change. The viral videos, the relentless calls for reform, and the inspired public testimonies had coalesced into an unstoppable movement. In living rooms across America, citizens of all walks of life turned on their televisions and logged into social media, united in a fervent determination that the era of unchecked authority had come to an end. The moment was historic. Jasmine's measured defiance and her unwavering commitment to the truth had transformed a personal legal battle into a powerful rallying cry for systemic change. Legislators pledged to conduct sweeping reviews of judicial practices, while legal watchdog organizations vowed never to allow a single dissenting voice to be silenced under the weight of monetary intimidation. The impact of that single day rippled outward, spawning grassroots initiatives that called for greater transparency in government institutions, reforms in judicial accountability, and an unyielding commitment to protect the rights of every individual. As the ceremony drew to a close, Jasmine stepped away from the podium and walked toward the exit with the quiet dignity that had defined her struggle all along. Reporters jostled for interviews as cameras captured every moment of her triumphant stride. In that final fleeting moment before she departed, she paused, turned, and spoke softly into the microphone, her voice carrying the fervor of conviction and gentle hope. When one woman does not remain silent, millions begin to speak. Her words became the definitive refrain of the day, echoing across news cycles and public forums alike. They were a promise of change, a challenge to each of us to raise our voices for truth and justice. Behind her, a sea of supporters erupted in cheers, their applause not just an acknowledgement of her personal victory, but the realization of a broader, long-overdue metamorphosis. He entered the courtroom as a target of injustice and emerged as the hero of a nation. Subscribe so you won't miss the next story that will open your eyes.